English Listening Podcast. TOEIC 900 points. Chapter 1. Macroeconomic Policy Frameworks and Central Banking. Contemporary macroeconomic policy frameworks endeavor to reconcile multiple, occasionally contradictory objectives while operating within institutional constraints and political realities. Central banks, having evolved substantially from their origins as government financing vehicles, now predominantly operate with statutory independence that insulates monetary policy decisions from short-term political pressures. This institutional arrangement reflects the prevailing economic orthodoxy that monetary credibility, the market's conviction that authorities will maintain price stability, constitutes a prerequisite for sustainable economic growth. Nevertheless, the practical implementation of central bank independence varies considerably across jurisdictions, with subtle yet consequential distinctions in appointment procedures, mandate specifications, and accountability mechanisms. The predominant monetary policy framework among advanced economies features inflation targeting, whereby central banks explicitly announce numerical objectives for price stability. This approach, which supplanted previous frameworks emphasizing monetary aggregates or exchange rate stability, enhances transparency while providing an unambiguous benchmark for assessing policy effectiveness. The operational mechanics typically involve adjusting short-term interest rates to influence broader financial conditions, thereby modulating aggregate demand to align with the economy's productive capacity. Unconventional monetary policies, including quantitative easing, negative interest rates, and forward guidance, have supplemented traditional interest rate management during periods when conventional tools approached their effective constraints. These innovations have expanded central banks' policy arsenals while simultaneously generating unprecedented questions regarding long-term efficacy and unintended consequences. Fiscal policy formulation necessitates navigating complex trade-offs between short-term stabilization objectives and long-term sustainability imperatives. Automatic stabilizers, including progressive taxation systems and countercyclical expenditure programs, moderate economic fluctuations without requiring discretionary intervention. Discretionary fiscal measures provide additional policy flexibility, but frequently encounter implementation lags that diminish their effectiveness as countercyclical tools. Moreover, political economy considerations often generate asymmetric policy responses across economic cycles, with stimulus measures during downturns rarely counterbalanced by equivalent restraint during expansionary periods. This tendency, combined with demographic pressures on age-related expenditures, has produced concerning public debt trajectories in numerous advanced economies. Macroprudential policy frameworks have emerged as complements to traditional macroeconomic management tools, focusing specifically on systemic financial stability rather than individual institution soundness. This approach acknowledges that financial systems exhibit procyclical tendencies, with risk accumulating during benign conditions before manifesting during stress episodes. Instruments such as countercyclical capital buffers, loan-to-value restrictions, and sectoral capital requirements aim to moderate these cycles by constraining excessive credit expansion during upturns while releasing capacity during downturns. Institutional arrangements for macroprudential oversight vary substantially, with some jurisdictions assigning primary responsibility to central banks, while others establish dedicated financial stability committees with multi-agency representation. The relative novelty of comprehensive macroprudential frameworks leaves considerable uncertainty regarding optimal institutional design and instrument calibration. Chapter 2. Quantum Computing and Post-Quantum Cryptography. Quantum computing represents a paradigmatic departure from classical computation by harnessing quantum mechanical phenomena, specifically superposition and entanglement, to manipulate information. While classical computers utilize bits that definitively exist in either 0 or 1 states, quantum computers employ quantum bits, qubits, that can simultaneously embody multiple states through superposition. Entanglement further enhances computational capability by creating correlated quantum states wherein the measurement of one qubit instantaneously determines another's state, regardless of physical separation. These properties enable quantum algorithms to address certain computational problems with exponentially greater efficiency than their classical counterparts. However, maintaining quantum coherence, preserving these delicate quantum states against environmental interference, presents formidable engineering challenges that have thus far constrained practical implementations. The development trajectory of quantum computing hardware encompasses multiple competing architectural approaches. Superconducting circuits currently dominate industrial implementations, utilizing Josephson junctions cooled to near absolute zero to create and manipulate quantum states. Trapped ion systems employ precisely controlled laser beams to induce quantum operations on electrically charged atoms suspended in electromagnetic fields. Topological quantum computing, though less mature, offers theoretical advantages through error-assistant qubits based on exotic quasiparticles. Each approach presents distinct advantages and engineering challenges, with no definitive consensus regarding which platform will ultimately prove most scalable. Hybrid systems that combine quantum processors with classical computing resources represent the most practical near-term architecture, with quantum components addressing specialized subroutines within broader classical algorithms. The cryptographic implications of quantum computing have catalyzed substantial research into post-quantum cryptographic standards. Shor's algorithm, when implemented on sufficiently powerful quantum computers, renders current public key cryptographic systems vulnerable by efficiently solving the integer factorization and discrete logarithm problems that underpin their security. This theoretical capability threatens the confidentiality of currently encrypted data and the authentication mechanisms securing digital infrastructure. Post-quantum cryptographic algorithms derive their security from alternative mathematical problems presumed resistant to quantum computational advantages. Lattice-based cryptography employs the computational difficulty of finding shortest vectors in high-dimensional lattices, while code-based approaches utilize the complexity of decoding general linear codes. Hash-based signature schemes, multivariate polynomial systems, and supersingular elliptic curve isogenies represent additional candidates undergoing rigorous security analysis and standardization processes. Quantum communication technologies exploit fundamental quantum properties to achieve unprecedented security guarantees. Quantum key distribution protocols leverage the principle that measuring unknown quantum states inevitably disturbs them, thereby revealing eavesdropping attempts. This approach enables the distribution of cryptographic keys with security derived from physical laws rather than computational complexity assumptions. Quantum networks extend these capabilities by connecting multiple quantum devices through entanglement distribution, potentially enabling secure multi-party computation and distributed quantum processing. Satellite-based quantum communication has demonstrated feasibility over intercontinental distances, addressing the range limitations inherent in fiber optic implementations. However, practical deployment faces substantial challenges regarding key generation rates, network integration, and vulnerability to sophisticated side-channel attacks targeting implementation imperfections rather than theoretical principles. Chapter 3: Corporate Governance and Institutional Investment. Contemporary corporate governance frameworks balance competing stakeholder interests within legal structures that ultimately assign fiduciary responsibilities to directors. The principal-agent relationship inherent in modern corporate structures, wherein dispersed shareholders delegate operational control to professional managers, creates potential conflicts that governance mechanisms endeavor to mitigate. Independent board oversight constitutes the primary institutional safeguard, with directors responsible for monitoring executive performance, approving strategic initiatives, and ensuring regulatory compliance. However, information asymmetries between management and directors, combined with the part-time nature of board service, create persistent challenges regarding oversight effectiveness. Proxy advisory firms have emerged as influential intermediaries providing governance recommendations to institutional investors, though their concentrated market power and standardized evaluation frameworks have generated controversy regarding appropriate accountability. Shareholder activism has evolved from confrontational tactics focused on immediate returns toward more sophisticated engagement strategies addressing governance structures and long-term value creation. Activist hedge funds employ substantial research capabilities to identify underperforming companies with specific operational or financial inefficiencies that, once addressed, could generate significant shareholder value. Their interventions typically involve acquiring minority stakes, followed by public campaigns advocating specific strategic changes, often culminating in proxy contests for board representation. Institutional investors increasingly support reasonable activist proposals that align with long-term performance improvement rather than short-term financial engineering. This evolution reflects growing recognition that effective stewardship responsibilities extend beyond passive ownership to constructive engagement with portfolio companies on material governance concerns. Environmental, social, and governance (ESG) considerations have transitioned from specialized ethical investment criteria to mainstream financial materiality factors. Institutional investors increasingly incorporate ESG metrics into investment decision processes based on mounting evidence linking sustainability performance with financial outcomes. Climate-related financial disclosures have achieved particular prominence, with investors demanding comprehensive assessment of both transition risks associated with decarbonization policies and physical risks stemming from climate change impacts. Proxy voting guidelines increasingly specify ESG expectations regarding board diversity, executive compensation structures, and environmental management systems. Stock exchanges and securities regulators have progressively implemented mandatory sustainability disclosure requirements, though significant variation persists regarding scope, specificity, and verification standards across jurisdictions. Executive compensation design attempts to align management incentives with long-term shareholder interests while avoiding unintended consequences that encourage excessive risk-taking or financial manipulation. Performance metrics increasingly incorporate both financial and operational indicators, with relative measures comparing outcomes against industry peers to control for macroeconomic factors beyond management influence. Equity-based compensation, including stock options, restricted shares, and performance units, creates direct alignment with shareholder experience while encouraging appropriate risk management. Clawback provisions enable recovery of previously awarded compensation following financial restatements or misconduct determinations. Say-and-pay voting mechanisms provide shareholders with advisory input regarding compensation policies, creating reputational consequences for boards that disregard investor concerns. Despite these refinements, optimal compensation design remains contested, with persistent debates regarding appropriate performance horizons, metric selection, and total magnitude relative to average employee compensation. Chapter 4: Advanced Materials Science and Nanotechnology. Materials science has undergone revolutionary transformation through computational modeling capabilities that enable atomic-level design of novel materials with precisely tailored properties. Density functional theory provides quantum mechanical frameworks for calculating electron distributions and energy states, allowing prediction of structural, mechanical, and electronic characteristics before physical synthesis. High-throughput computational screening methodologies evaluate thousands of potential material compositions to identify promising candidates for experimental verification. These approaches have accelerated materials development cycles by orders of magnitude compared to traditional empirical methods. The Materials Genome Initiative exemplifies this paradigm shift, creating comprehensive databases linking composition, processing techniques, and resultant properties to facilitate discovery of materials with unprecedented performance characteristics for specific applications. Metamaterials represent an extraordinary category of engineered materials deriving their properties from structural features rather than chemical composition. These composites incorporate precisely arranged subwavelength elements that manipulate electromagnetic radiation through mechanisms impossible in naturally occurring materials. Negative refractive index metamaterials bend light in directions contradicting conventional optical principles, enabling super-resolution imaging that transcends traditional diffraction limits. Electromagnetic cloaking devices redirect waves around objects, effectively rendering them invisible within specific frequency ranges. Acoustic metamaterials similarly control sound propagation, creating possibilities for focused ultrasonic therapy and enhanced noise cancellation systems. The development of tunable and reconfigurable metamaterials, responsive to external stimuli such as electrical fields or mechanical stress, represents the frontier of this rapidly evolving domain. Nanomaterials science investigates structures with dimensions between 1 and 100 nanometers, where quantum effects and enormously increased surface volume ratios generate properties diverging dramatically from bulk materials. Carbon nanotubes exhibit extraordinary tensile strength, exceeding steel by orders of magnitude, while providing electrical conductivity comparable to copper at a fraction of the weight. Graphene, consisting of singly tomthic carbon sheets, displays remarkable electron mobility alongside optical transparency and mechanical flexibility, creating possibilities for transformative electronic applications. Semiconductor quantum dots enable precise control of electromagnetic emission frequencies through size manipulation, finding applications in display technologies and biological imaging. Nanomedicine leverages these unique properties for targeted drug delivery systems that concentrate therapeutic agents at disease sites while minimizing systemic exposure and associated side effects. Advanced ceramics have transcended traditional applications through microstructural engineering that overcomes inherent brittleness while preserving desirable properties including heat resistance, chemical stability, and wear resistance. Processing innovations, such as spark plasma sintering, achieve fully dense structures without extended high-temperature exposure that would promote grain growth and associated embrittlement. Ceramic matrix composites incorporate reinforcing phases that interrupt crack propagation through mechanisms including crack deflection, fiber bridging, and microcracking, resulting in unprecedented toughness. Transparent ceramics combine optical clarity with mechanical properties and thermal stability exceeding conventional glasses, enabling applications from armor systems to laser gain media. Piezoelectric ceramics transform mechanical energy into electrical signals and vice versa, forming critical components in sensors, actuators, and energy harvesting systems. Chapter 5: International Financial Architecture and Monetary Systems. The international monetary system has evolved through distinct historical phases, each characterized by specific institutional arrangements governing exchange rate determination and balance of payments adjustment mechanisms. The gold standard era provided automatic adjustment processes through specie flows, but imposed domestic policy constraints incompatible with modern democratic governance. The Bretton Woods system, established after World War II, combined fixed but adjustable exchange rates with capital controls, providing monetary autonomy within defined parameters. The contemporary floating exchange rate regime theoretically allows independent monetary policy alongside free capital movement, though fear of floating considerations frequently motivates central bank intervention in currency markets. Recent proposals for international monetary reform have ranged from restoration of commodity-based standards to supranational currency creation, reflecting persistent dissatisfaction with exchange rate volatility and asymmetric adjustment pressures under current arrangements. Global financial institutions established after World War II continue to evolve in response to changing economic realities and power distributions. The International Monetary Fund provides balance of payments support conditional upon policy adjustments, though its governance structure and conditionality requirements have generated persistent criticism regarding legitimacy and effectiveness. The World Bank Group has transitioned from post-war reconstruction financing toward broader development objectives, including poverty reduction and sustainability promotion. Regional development banks complement these global institutions with specialized knowledge and political legitimacy within their geographic spheres. The Financial Stability Board, established following the 2008 financial crisis, coordinates regulatory policies across jurisdictions to address vulnerabilities in the international financial system. These institutional arrangements collectively constitute an incomplete global financial architecture that reflects pragmatic compromises rather than coherent design principles. International capital flows have expanded dramatically in both volume and complexity, creating benefits through efficient resource allocation alongside potential vulnerabilities to sudden reversals. Portfolio investment provides liquidity to recipient capital markets while offering diversification benefits to investors, though these positions can reverse rapidly during risk aversion episodes. Foreign direct investment establishes longer-term economic linkages with greater stability, though raising concerns regarding national sovereignty and distributional impacts. Banking flows transmit monetary conditions across borders while creating potential financial stability risks through currency and maturity mismatches. The expansion of gross international investment positions relative to economic output has increased potential spillover channels for financial disturbances, complicating domestic policy formulation and creating demand for international policy coordination mechanisms. Financial crises throughout history have exhibited recurring patterns despite varying proximate causes and institutional contexts. Excessive leverage accumulation during benign periods creates vulnerability to asset price corrections that trigger deleveraging spirals. Banking crises feature depositor runs that, absent effective intervention, transform liquidity challenges into solvency failures with broader macroeconomic consequences. Currency crises involve speculative attacks against pegged exchange rates that policy authorities ultimately cannot defend, leading to disruptive devaluations. Sovereign debt crises occur when governments lose market access due to actual or perceived debt sustainability concerns, potentially leading to default or restructuring. Twin crises involving simultaneous banking and currency distress prove particularly damaging through mutually reinforcing negative feedback loops. Financial regulatory frameworks continuously evolve in response to crisis experiences, though innovation and regulatory arbitrage ensure that vulnerabilities persist in modified forms rather than disappearing entirely. Chapter 6: Cognitive Neuroscience and Decision Architecture. Cognitive neuroscience integrates psychological theories with neurobiological measurement to elucidate brain mechanisms underlying complex mental processes. Neuroimaging technologies, including functional magnetic resonance imaging, electroencephalography, and magnetoencephalography, provide complementary insights regarding spatial localization and temporal dynamics of neural activity associated with cognitive operations. Single-cell recording techniques offer unprecedented resolution regarding individual neuron contributions to information processing, though primarily in animal models. Optogenetic methods enable precise activation or inhibition of specific neural circuits through genetically encoded light-sensitive proteins, revolutionizing causal investigation of brain behavior relationships. These methodologies collectively transform understanding of cognitive processes from abstract constructs toward physically instantiated neural computations, though significant knowledge gaps persist regarding how microscale neural activity generates macroscale psychological phenomena. Decision neuroscience reveals that human choice behavior emerges from interactions between multiple neural systems rather than unitary evaluation processes. The dopaminergic reward system encodes value predictions and prediction errors that drive reinforcement learning, enabling adaptation to changing environmental contingencies without conscious deliberation. The prefrontal cortex supports cognitive control processes that override automatic responses when appropriate, with dorsolateral regions implementing working memory and ventromedial areas representing integrated subjective value. The anterior cingulate cortex monitors conflicts between competing response tendencies and signals requirements for enhanced control allocation. The amygdala and insula contribute emotional salience that influences decision weights, particularly regarding potential losses or ambiguous outcomes. Individual differences in decision-making tendencies correspond to structural and functional variations across these neural circuits, providing biological grounding for behavioral economic observations. Heuristics and cognitive biases reflect adaptive mental shortcuts that provide computational efficiency at the expense of occasional systematic errors. Availability heuristics assess probability based on recall accessibility, generating biases when memorable instances inadequately represent actual frequencies. Anchoring effects demonstrate how initial reference points disproportionately influence subsequent judgments, even when these anchors contain no relevant information. Confirmation bias manifests through preferential attention to evidence supporting existing beliefs while discounting contradictory information. Present bias reflects hyperbolic temporal discounting that creates preference reversals as delayed outcomes approach. These phenomena represent neither irrational aberrations nor processing limitations, but rather adaptive cognitive mechanisms optimized for ancestral environments that occasionally malfunction in modern contexts, requiring precise statistical reasoning or extended time horizons. Choice architecture applies behavioral science insights to design decision environments that facilitate welfare-enhancing outcomes while preserving individual autonomy. Default options exert powerful influence through status quo bias and perceived endorsement effects, making carefully selected defaults particularly effective interventions when complete preference information is unavailable. Information framing influences choices through reference point effects and loss aversion, with equivalent outcomes evaluated differently when presented as potential gains versus potential losses. Simplification strategies reduce cognitive load by eliminating extraneous complexity that impedes optimal decision-making, particularly in contexts involving technical complexity or infrequent choices lacking regular feedback opportunities. Social norm information leverages conformity tendencies by communicating descriptive or injunctive norms that guide behavior in prosocial directions. These approaches preserve freedom of choice while acknowledging and accommodating realistic cognitive constraints rather than assuming idealized rational calculation. Chapter 7: Biotechnology and Precision Medicine. Genome editing technologies have revolutionized biological research and therapeutic development through unprecedented precision in genetic modification. CRISPR-Cas systems, adapted from bacterial immune mechanisms, employ RNA-guided nucleases to induce targeted DNA breaks that cells repair through either non-homologous end joining or homology-directed repair. The former typically introduces disruptive mutations that inactivate gene function, while the latter enables precise sequence insertion when template DNA is provided. Base editing technologies catalyze direct nucleotide conversion without introducing double-strand breaks, further refining modification specificity. Prime editing combines RNA guidance with reverse transcriptase activity to execute targeted insertions, deletions, and all possible base conversions. These technologies collectively enable correction of disease-causing mutations, modification of disease susceptibility factors, and engineering of cellular therapies with enhanced therapeutic properties. Regenerative medicine approaches tissue damage through strategies that restore, replace, or regenerate compromised cells and structures. Stem cell therapies leverage pluripotent or multipotent progenitor cells that differentiate into specific lineages under appropriate conditions, potentially replacing damaged tissues. Induced pluripotent stem cells, derived through reprogramming of adult somatic cells, circumvent ethical concerns associated with embryonic sources while providing patient-matched material that minimizes immunological rejection. Tissue engineering combines cells with biocompatible scaffolds that provide structural support and environmental cues guiding cellular organization into functional tissues. Biomaterial innovations have progressed from inert substances toward bioactive materials that modulate immune responses, deliver morphogenic signals, and degrade at rates coordinated with natural healing processes. These complementary approaches collectively address the fundamental limitations of traditional pharmaceuticals in treating conditions involving structural tissue damage. Personalized medicine tailors therapeutic selection and dosing based on individual patient characteristics, particularly genetic factors influencing drug metabolism and target sensitivity. Pharmacogenomic testing identifies genetic variants affecting drug metabolizing enzymes, transporters, receptors, and immune response factors that collectively determine therapeutic efficacy and toxicity risk. Companion diagnostics developed alongside targeted therapies identify patients most likely to benefit from specific interventions while sparing others from unnecessary treatment and potential adverse effects. Liquid biopsy techniques detect circulating tumor DNA, enabling non-invasive cancer characterization and treatment response monitoring. Genetic risk assessment integrates polygenic scores across multiple common variants to estimate disease susceptibility, informing preventive interventions and screening protocols. These approaches collectively shift medical practice from population-based empirical treatment toward biologically informed precision interventions. Synthetic biology applies engineering principles to biological systems, creating novel functions through rational design and construction of genetic circuits. Standardized genetic parts with characterized behaviors enable predictable assembly of complex biological devices that implement sophisticated information processing operations. Metabolic engineering optimizes microbial production pathways through systematic modification of enzymatic reactions and regulatory elements, creating cellular factories that convert inexpensive feedstocks into high-value compounds including pharmaceuticals, specialty chemicals, and biofuels. Engineered microbial consortia distribute metabolic functions across multiple specialized cell types that exchange intermediates, enhancing overall system efficiency and stability. Cell-free synthetic biology platforms eliminate constraints associated with maintaining cellular viability, enabling implementation of cytotoxic pathways and simplified regulatory control. These capabilities collectively expand the chemical repertoire available for human purposes while potentially reducing environmental impacts associated with traditional chemical manufacturing processes. Chapter 8: Climate Science and Decarbonization Pathways. Climate modeling has evolved from simplified energy balance calculations toward Earth system models, incorporating complex interactions among atmosphere, oceans, land surfaces, ice sheets, and biogeochemical cycles. General circulation models solve fundamental equations of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics across three-dimensional grids to simulate atmospheric and oceanic circulation patterns that distribute heat and moisture globally. Parameterization schemes represent subgrid processes including cloud formation, precipitation, and turbulent mixing that occur at scales below explicit resolution capabilities. Ensemble approaches run multiple simulations with varied initial conditions or parameter values to characterize projection uncertainties and distinguish forced climate response from internal variability. Despite substantial improvements in spatial resolution and process representation, persistent challenges remain regarding precipitation patterns, cloud feedback mechanisms, and climate sensitivity parameters. Attribution science methodologically connects specific climate events and trends to anthropogenic forcing through statistical approaches that quantify changed probability distributions. Fingerprinting techniques identify spatial and temporal patterns associated with different forcing mechanisms, distinguishing greenhouse gas influences from solar variability, volcanic aerosols, and internal climate modes. Fraction of attributable risk methodologies compare event probabilities under observed conditions against counterfactual scenarios without anthropogenic emissions, expressing causality in probabilistic terms consistent with complex system behavior. Rapid attribution studies apply established methodological frameworks to analyze extreme events shortly after occurrence, informing public understanding while media attention remains focused. These approaches collectively transform climate change from abstract statistical trends toward specific impacts with identifiable causation, though attribution confidence varies substantially across different event types and geographical regions. Decarbonization pathways model transition trajectories toward net zero greenhouse gas emissions while maintaining energy services essential for economic development and human welfare. Integrated assessment models couple economic and energy system representations with simplified climate components to evaluate policy scenarios regarding emissions, costs, and temperature outcomes. Electrification strategies leverage renewable generation to displace direct fossil fuel combustion across transportation, building, and industrial sectors. Green hydrogen produced through electrolysis using renewable electricity provides potential solutions for applications resistant to direct electrification, including certain industrial processes, heavy transportation, and seasonal energy storage. Carbon capture technologies extract CO2 from concentrated industrial sources or ambient air for underground sequestration or utilization in durable products. These complementary approaches collectively enable deep emissions reductions, though optimal technology portfolios vary across sectors and regions based on resource endowments and existing infrastructure. Climate adaptation encompasses adjustments in human and natural systems that moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities associated with observed or expected climate changes. Vulnerability assessment methodologies identify populations and infrastructure exposed to specific climate hazards while considering sensitivity and adaptive capacity factors that determine ultimate impact severity. Ecosystem-based adaptation leverages natural systems including wetlands, forests, and coastal habitats that provide protective services against floods, storms, and heat, while delivering additional biodiversity and carbon sequestration benefits. Climate-resilient infrastructure incorporates future conditions rather than historical patterns into design parameters, potentially accepting higher initial costs to reduce life cycle expenses and failure probabilities. Managed retreat strategies recognize limits to physical protection by systematically relocating assets and activities from areas facing unavoidable climate impacts. These approaches collectively acknowledge that some degree of climate change remains inevitable despite mitigation efforts, necessitating parallel adaptation planning to reduce resulting damages. Chapter 9: Advanced Economic Theories and Market Structures. Behavioral economics integrates psychological insights regarding cognitive limitations and social preferences into economic analysis, challenging neoclassical assumptions of unbounded rationality, willpower, and self-interest. Prospect theory replaces expected utility with reference-dependent evaluation functions exhibiting loss aversion and diminishing sensitivity, better explaining observed choice patterns under uncertainty. Hyperbolic discounting models capture preference reversals over time that contradict exponential discounting assumptions underlying standard intertemporal choice theory. Social preference frameworks incorporate altruism, reciprocity, and inequality aversion that influence economic decisions beyond material self-interest. These behavioral extensions enhance descriptive accuracy and predictive validity, while suggesting policy interventions that account for realistic psychological processes rather than idealized rational calculation. Market design applies mechanism design theory to create institutions that efficiently allocate resources when standard competitive markets would fail due to externalities, indivisibilities, or informational complexities. Matching markets without price mechanisms, including school choice, organ donation, and medical residency assignments, require specialized algorithms that produce stable assignments where no participants can improve their outcomes through alternative arrangements. Auction mechanisms elicit private valuation information through carefully structured bidding procedures that align incentives for truthful revelation. Two-sided platforms create value by reducing transaction costs between distinct user groups with interdependent demand, creating complex pricing challenges regarding optimal extraction of created surplus. These applications demonstrate how theoretical economic insights can directly inform institutional design to improve allocation outcomes across diverse contexts. Information economics examines how asymmetric information distribution influences market functioning and institutional structures. Adverse selection arises when information asymmetries regarding unobservable quality precede transactions, potentially causing market failure, as in Akerlof's market for lemons, where quality uncertainty drives higher quality offerings from the market. Signaling models demonstrate how costly actions, including education acquisition, may serve primarily to credibly communicate unobservable characteristics rather than directly enhancing productivity. Moral hazard problems emerge when actions affecting outcome probabilities remain unobservable after contracting, necessitating incentive structures that align principal and agent interests despite monitoring limitations. Screening mechanisms, including nonlinear pricing and contractual menus, induce self-selection that reveals private information through choice behavior. These frameworks collectively explain numerous market features, including warranties, deductibles, performance bonding, and relationship-specific investments. Institutional economics examines how formal and informal rules shape economic activity beyond price mechanisms emphasized in neoclassical analysis. Transaction cost economics explains organizational boundaries by analyzing comparative costs of market exchange versus hierarchical coordination under conditions of asset specificity, uncertainty, and bounded rationality. Property rights theory demonstrates how resource allocation efficiency depends on clear entitlement definition, enforcement mechanisms, and transferability provisions. Path dependence models explain how historical contingencies create persistent effects through self-reinforcing processes including learning effects, coordination benefits, and adaptive expectations. Comparative institutional analysis examines how varying governance structures across societies differentially support productive economic activity through contract enforcement, corruption control, and regulatory quality. These approaches collectively emphasize that markets themselves represent institutional achievements requiring supportive legal, social, and political foundations rather than spontaneous natural phenomena. Chapter 10: Algorithmic Decision Systems and Information Disorder. Machine learning systems increasingly influence consequential decisions across domains including lending, hiring, criminal justice, and healthcare through algorithmic processing of historical data to identify predictive patterns. Supervised learning algorithms optimize prediction functions, mapping input features to target variables through iterative error minimization, while unsupervised approaches identify inherent data structures without labeled examples. Deep learning architectures employing multiple processing layers enable automatic feature extraction from raw inputs, achieving unprecedented performance on complex perceptual tasks, including image classification and natural language processing. However, these systems inevitably inherit historical biases encoded in training data, potentially perpetuating or amplifying discriminatory patterns without explicit programming of prejudicial rules. Moreover, post-hoc explainability remains challenging for complex models, creating accountability gaps when algorithmic decisions significantly impact individual opportunities and outcomes. Algorithmic fairness frameworks propose mathematical definitions and technical approaches for addressing disparate impacts across demographic groups. Individual fairness requires that similar individuals receive similar algorithmic treatment, though operationalizing similarity metrics remains contentious. Group fairness concepts including demographic parity, equal opportunity, and predictive parity impose statistical constraints across protected attribute categories, though impossibility theorems demonstrate that multiple reasonable fairness criteria cannot be simultaneously satisfied when base rates differ between groups. Causal approaches distinguish legitimate predictive features from problematic proxies by modeling intervention effects rather than mere statistical associations. Preprocessing techniques modify training data to mitigate embedded biases, while in-processing approaches incorporate fairness constraints directly into model optimization objectives. These technical interventions, while valuable, ultimately require normative judgments regarding appropriate fairness concepts for specific decision contexts. Information disorder encompasses various forms of problematic content that undermine informed discourse and decision-making. Misinformation involves false content shared without deceptive intent, often through incomplete verification practices or cognitive biases that privilege alignment with existing beliefs. Disinformation campaigns deliberately disseminate deceptive content, frequently employing inauthentic coordination across multiple accounts to create artificial impression of widespread belief. Computational propaganda leverages automated accounts and algorithmic amplification to maximize reach while minimizing attribution to originating sources. Deepfake technologies generating synthetic media with unprecedented realism exacerbate verification challenges by undermining traditional heuristics associating visual evidence with reality. These phenomena collectively threaten epistemic security, the capacity to distinguish reliable from unreliable information, with implications for democratic processes, public health, and social cohesion. Content governance frameworks attempt to balance expressive freedom with harm prevention across digital platforms that have become essential infrastructure for contemporary discourse. Content moderation systems employ human reviewers and automated classification to enforce platform policies, though scale challenges and contextual subtleties create persistent accuracy limitations. Algorithmic recommendation systems shape information exposure through personalization processes that potentially create filter bubbles reinforcing existing beliefs while limiting exposure to diverse perspectives. Platform design features including friction mechanisms, circuit breakers, and virality limitations potentially mitigate harmful content spread without categorical prohibition. Regulatory approaches increasingly hold platforms responsible for systematic outcomes rather than individual content decisions, though jurisdictional fragmentation creates compliance challenges for global services. These governance challenges fundamentally involve contested value trade-offs between competing legitimate interests rather than merely technical optimization problems.